and welcome to Once Upon a Town, the show where we delve deep into Franklin history. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
Joe, what will we be talking about today?
Well, today we're going to talk about that area of downtown Franklin where the A.J. Cataldo Block is located. Because back in the old days, the Spear Block was located there. And then in later years, they built the A.J. Cataldo building. And then we're also going to talk about the Exchange building, which is just on the other side of the bridge. First, we'll talk about the Spear Block. Now, this is a picture that was taken back probably around the early 1900s. And the arrow points to the building, one of the buildings that was that was part of the Spear Block. The Spear Block was actually made up of two different buildings. But the one that the arrow was pointing to was the William H. Spear and Son Fish and Oyster Store. And that's the one with the flagpole. And you can also see the Waterman's Steam Laundry further down the road. And we'll talk about that. Now here's a picture that was taken in the, I'm going to guess the late 60s. And it looks pretty much like it does today, with the exception of Jimmy's Ice Cream is no longer there. That's just a little vacant lot now. But you can see the Cataldo building has been built. Next to it, to the right, is the so-called Sentinel building. The Sentinel's long gone now, but that's been referred to as the Sentinel building in the past. But that's where that's what's there today. That's where the building was for the Spear Block. And now here's from the 1884 Sanborn fire map, and we see the arrow points to where the two separate buildings that made up the Spear Block. The arrow points to the first one, and the red lines shows where the Waterman Laundry was to be built in later years. The building that had the flagpole was the Fish and Oyster building, store, and that's what that arrow is pointing to. And then you can also see a tiny little building just to the left. It's like at an angle, and that's the building that was a cobbler shop there. Mm-hmm. And
looks like there was a billiards club up on would that be the second floor of that building with the oyster and fish mart?
I'm pretty sure it was on the second floor, yeah. Mm-hmm. And A.J. Cataldo would eventually add a smaller building to the left. That's what that little building is. That eventually became the fruit stand, and we'll talk about that. And then the steam laundry was where that red outline is. Now here's a view that's taken from the 1888 drawing of Franklin. And building number 61 is where the steam laundry was eventually built. And actually that is the steam laundry building, I should say. Building number 63, that's the one with the flagpole, and that was where the Fish and Oyster Store was. And in later years, Edward King would have a barber shop located there. And in the 1890s, he would build a small building that was across the street near the bridge. In fact, it was right next to the bridge, and that's where he moved his barber shop to. In later years, Bullock and Oil would have a little office in that building. It's where the Rum Restaurant is today. And then this is from the 1899 Sanborn fire map. We now see the steam laundry building having been built. We can see a restaurant in the other Spears building to the left. We can see the cobbler shop, and we can also see yet another new building built to the left of it. And those buildings made up the fruit stand that A.J. Cataldo ran. And those would be eventually demolished, and it's just an empty lot today, as I was saying. So now, this article appeared in the 1890 Franklin Sentinel in January. The Waterman Laundry was taken over by somebody, Deward McDougall, and he renamed it the Franklin Steam and Hand Laundry. And as the article says, the reputation for good work in the past was done in the past and will be kept up. And so make sure you give the guy your business. And
all the new proprietors ask is a trial by the gentlemen and ladies of Franklin and surrounding towns.
That's right.
And it will not be their fault if your patronage is not continued.
That's right. Don't blame them. That's right. So then John Waterman bought it, and he took possession. This was in 1891, and a new laundry wagon would be put up on the routes, and the place would be refitted in first-class shape, and so it would be the best equipped business of its kind. So, and then in later years, in 1909, Franklin Business Directory, this advertisement was there, and shirts were done 10 cents, and collars and cuffs, a cent each. I wonder if cuffs a cent each. So that means each cuff had 1 cent. It paid 1 cent. No.
That's a very good question, Joe.
Oh, I know. But family washing, 6.5 cents per pound. So, wow. And then, and in 1913, in June of 1913, Joseph Cataldo purchased the Spear property, and he purchased it from the present property owner, which was Annie Spear. So I'm not sure, but I think maybe Mr. Spear had died, and she owned the property at that time. And at that time, the tenants were the barber shop and a fruit dealer. And as I mentioned, that was Edward King. He was the barber. So, and then the laundry became Sherman's Laundry. This was from 1913, and became Sherman's Laundry. And then yet again, it changed hands again and became the Franklin Laundry. This was 1921. And then this was taken from 1922 Franklin Sentinel, and headquarters at 15 East Central Street. And at that time, the Sentinel building, I don't believe, had been built yet. So that was still in the older building. But then in 1923, A.J. Cataldo decided to tear down the buildings that were on the Spear Block, and he decided to construct what now is the A.J. Cataldo building. And so he did that. And as the article says, he erected a 2-story brick building, a store and office building, adjoining his present store. The present store was the fruit stand, which became Jimmy's ice cream stand in later years. And it would have a 63-foot frontage and ornamental tapestry brick with stone trimmings. Really, it's a beautiful building when you look at it. And he establishes he will contribute a valuable addition to the business section of Franklin. So, now let's talk about the A.J. Cataldo building. Now, when you look at it from using Google Earth, you can see that the back left side of the building is at an angle. I mean, for so many years, I would look at that building from the ground level, or even from the side level, and it never really occurred to me that it was at that angle. I figured it was just a square building, but it's really something. I didn't realize that.
Of course, today this has, I believe, one of the offices for the Franklin Downtown Partnership, the community group that's been very focused on revitalizing our downtown.
That's correct.
Until recently had Jane's Frames in there, a great local business. There's actually a new frame store in there, but I'm forgetting the name of it off the top of my head. And I believe an H&R Block office.
Yes.
It's also, that rooftop is much frequented by the pigeons of downtown Franklin, I can attest.
Oh, wow. So, yeah, that's Jimmy's Ice Cream was in the building to the left, as I said. A.J. Cataldo. A.J. stands for Amadeo. It was Amadeo Joseph Cataldo. Yeah, he went by Joe Cataldo apparently in later years. Now here you can see in red the outline of the A.J. Cataldo building, and you can see why the building was at that angle. I'm pretty sure that was the property line where the railroad tracks were. Although you look at the fruit stand to the far left, and it's on the other side of the line, so I'm not sure about that, and I'm just going to say I think that was the property line, and I'll just leave it at that. But anyway, you can see that's the reason for the angle on the back of the building. So, and in the 1930s, this is what the building looked like. You can see GLORIA chain stores was there. The Great Atlantic and Pacific store was there.
The GLORIA chain stores one is interesting. It looks like the sign is in Italian.
There is. It says
La Bottega della vostra economia.
Vostra economia.
So a quick search on Google Translate indicates that phrase, La Bottega della vostra economica, translates from Italian to English as the shop of your business.
Interesting. I think it was basically a grocery store, I believe. Well, I don't know, but the next door, the Great Atlantic and Pacific was definitely a grocery store because that was A&P. A lot of people wonder what A&P stood for, Atlantic and Pacific.
Atlantic and Pacific, Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company definitely has a better ring to it than A&P, I have to say.
Absolutely. In later years, they moved over to West Central Street. And then the 2 stores to the right is A.J. Cataldo had a hardware store in there. And we'll actually see that better in this picture. hardware and plumbing, had his plumbing business out of there. And you can see where the A&P was. Now there's Scott's store was there.
Would that have been a grocery store as well, or?
No, I think it was a shoe store. I'm pretty sure. And then different businesses started there back in 1925, just after the building was built. You had typical stores like McDonald's Millinery. Millinery was in the Cataldo Block. They sold hats and things there. Aladdin lamp shop was.
Oh, what a great name for a business!
I know it. Actually, it was located up in the room 2, which tells me that was probably located upstairs on the 2nd floor. They had offices up there.
It's very interesting seeing what services and products they offer. Orders taken for hand painting on silk, Japanese novelties, hem stitching, and perhaps best of all, free instruction in lampshade making.
Wow!
Should you need it?
Yep, that was 1926. That was taken from. And then A.J. Cataldo hardware, plumbing and heating. This was in 1932 from the Franklin Sentinel. They used to have, every year they would have Franklin Days where all the merchants would advertise heavily and things. And so that was taken for that. And then this is actually showing when in 1933, when that A&P opened in the Cataldo Block, another new A&P store was opening, 7 East Central Street. The way it worked, the numbering system from left to right on that block, on the store level was 5, 7, 9 was the stores the offices upstairs, 11 and 13, and I think that's probably still true to this day for the numbering system on that building. So 7 was the second store to the left, from the left. Scott's Shoe Store, that verifies it was a shoe store, and they opened in February of 1938. Charles H. Scott was the proprietor, and so that was the opening of that. Gloria Chain, 5 Clark Square. Now Clark Square was that area right around where the bridge was. It was named for Lawrence Clark, who died in World War I. But some businesses would refer to them as being located at Clark Square instead of 5 East Central Street. So they sold fancy groceries, fresh fruits, and vegetables there. And then this picture dates back to, I'm guessing, around 1962. And then you can see just to the left where it says shop, that was Ron's men's shop. Ron Palumbo had a store there. And in fact, that's Ron Palumbo right in the picture with the suit, with the sport coat. And that was a 1961 Chevy Impala, by the way, in that picture. And then Tom Keefe actually started his insurance business at that location. He was there until I'm not sure exactly when he moved over to West Central Street. He built a building, but he was there. Tom Keefe actually started as a funeral director on Cottage Street. He bought the house at 33 Cottage Street and operated the Keefe Funeral Home there for a number of years. And
that's currently the Otiri Funeral Home?
Exactly, yep. Fred Pizzini bought it, and then Charles Otiri bought it from Fred Pizzini. So that's, but Tom Keefe was the funeral director there for a number of years. Yep. Now the A.J. Cataldo fruit stand, as we mentioned, was next to the Cataldo building, and this was taken probably in the late 60s, and this is the store that a lot of us remember, going there for penny candy. You'd go in and just take a left as soon as you went in the door, and right in the window was where all the penny candy was. And you would take a little brown bag, a little tiny little bag, and you would put the candy in the bag. You could, everything from mint juleps to the red devil balls, the fireballs or whatever, those, and different other types of candy. And then of course Jimmy Cajeas was the owner. You'd go over and he'd look in the bag and he'd count, okay, and then you'd pay for it. And a lot of people remember going to the Morse Theater and you'd buy the candy there and then go to the theater and eat. That was back in the day when they would allow you to bring your own candy in. You know, not so much today, but and then to the left he had a liquor store, and that was Franklin Liquors, and Jimmy also operated that as well. And this detail was taken from the 1899 Sanborn fire map, and the building that the building that's highlighted in blue is where the fruit stand was. and the building that's highlighted in red is where the tobacco and cobbler shop are located. Now, I was able to find an early picture of those buildings, and you can see A.J.F. Cataldo Confectionery, Tobaccos and Cigars. The building to the right was where the fruit stand was. Now, and that's A.J. Cataldo in the door. Now, I had mentioned how A.J. Cataldo stood for Amadeo Joseph, but in those days, they had like two middle names. So A.J.F. Cataldo stood for Amadeo Joseph Fiora Cataldo. So that was the way they did it. And you can see Mr. Cataldo standing in the door. And we saw this picture earlier. That was typical of that block. And then this picture was taken between 1923 and 1928, and you can see that it is called the Cataldo Fruit Store. And I know this was between 1923 and 1928 because the Cataldo Block has now been built, but it was before 1928 because the Morse Opera House had still been there before they burnt down in 1928. And here's a picture that was taken in the late 20s during a parade where you can see the Sons of Italy marching. And you can see the buildings. There was a restaurant in that location. And And then I saw this this notice in the May 29th, 1930 Franklin Sentinel. Jimmy Cahellas was Jimmy's ice cream. Mr. Cahellas and Mr. Constables, who have for several years operated the Ideal Fruit Store, they dissolved their partnership, and Mr. Constables would operate the Redstone Lunch, and Mr. Cahellas would continue the fruit stand. And it says, both gentlemen have earned the esteem and confidence of Franklin's people, who wish them continued success in their lines. And certainly Jimmy, for years, served a lot of us with all the candy. I mean, I've got the cavities to prove it. And they dissolved their partnership. I love this picture. This was taken probably in the early 50s. And I mean, look at the cars. Huh? Look at the car parked in front of Jimmy's. A beautiful car. And it's representative of what that area looked like back in the early 50s.
When I see a photo like this, I'm so glad that they didn't proceed with more of the urban redevelopment efforts that were proposed in the early 60s, which would have basically involved tearing the entire downtown down and turning it into a bad imitation of Southern California.
Right.
So we're very lucky that we actually have as much of the downtown, of this downtown, with all of its interesting architecture and layout, as we do today.
That's right. My mother was worried because this is the early 60s. We're going to do a program on the urban renewal eventually. My mother was worried because we lived on Dean Avenue, very close to the center of town, and they had shown drawings in the Sentinel of what was going to happen. And it was true. A lot of those buildings would be torn down, and my mother was worried that her house would be lost. But number one, it wasn't going to be included, and number two, urban renewal was shot down, so it became a moot point. But you're right, urban renewal would have really redid the whole downtown area. That's right. And we've seen this picture before. That's typical in the early 60s. So, and then we go to the Exchange Building. Now, the Exchange Building was just on the other side of the bridge, and that was located there. You can see Main Street, and you can see where Depot Street is to kind of give you an idea of where the Exchange Building was. This is probably one of the earliest pictures that I've seen of the Exchange Building. I'm figuring this picture dates back probably to the early 1860s. You can see the fence to the right. That's where the trains were. So I'm thinking the trains came through about that time. So that's probably about that time frame. But this picture definitely dates between 1868 and 1872. And the reason I know that is because we can see the Dean cupola, that little cupola right next to the arrow. Well, that Dean cupola was the original Dean Hall, which was completed in 1868, but it burned down in 1872. So it has to be between that 4-year time frame. And then the arrow points to the Exchange Building. This was from the 1888 map, and it's building number 44. And here's something that was taken from the 1938 Franklin Sentinel, and it shows that repairs were going on into the old Turner store. Now, one of the stores that was in that building was T.M. Turner had a grocery store there. But in 1898, a gentleman by the name of George Peck took it over. and it became known as Peck on the Square. And but before we talk about Peck on the Square, let's talk about some of the businesses that were there. In the early 1900s, we had T.M. Turner, and we had also a couple of dentists up on the second floor. We had Dr. Stetson and Dr. Pond. And then there was also a secondhand furniture store up in there as well. And that was over the Turner store. So. And then, as we talked about George Peck, in 1932, he took over, his store became affiliated with the Independent Grocers Alliance, and it became an IGA store. And they introduced this new concept of self-service where you would go around the store and do your own grocery shopping. It used to be the grocery stores the grocer would go around and take the furniture off the shelf himself and put it on the counter and say, okay, what else do you need? And he would go around and do that. But this new concept of self-serving was being introduced. And so, and then dozens of Franklin merchants were remodeling the stores throughout. New shelving and new counters were installed. And so that's how they introduced that. And then in March of 1932, there was the grand opening of the new IGA store. And from miles around, women and men and children are coming to see this spectacular example of modern efficiency grocery merchandising.
I love this ad copy.
I know it.
But this is still a home store run by home folks.
That's right.
Remember that, Joe?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I remember, and I vaguely remember when you would go into a store that had that type of a thing where when it came time to add up the prices, the grocer would take the brown paper bag and he would put all the numbers down. He would add them up and say, okay, there was no, the cash register did not do the addition. You had to do it yourself. So that was quite a thing. So here's a picture that was taken in the early 40s. And again, you can see with the IGA store, and you can was there and so on. Now here's a picture that shows the rear of the Exchange Block as taken from down by the railroad tracks. And it was a fairly large building. And then in 1942, George Peck retired. And this was taken from the Chilson film of 1942. And then Martin's department store would occupy that space. Now Martin's department store used to be in the block where Newberry's used to be, further down on the corner of Depot Street. But in 1944, they had a pretty big fire in the Depot Square block. And so Martin's didn't really sustain too much damage because of that fire, but he had to vacate the building. So he moved down to the Exchange building, and he stayed there until 1962. And I remember going into Martin's in that location myself, but that's where he was at that time. But in August of 1945, the current owner of the Exchange building decided to do some adding on to the front of the building. In earlier years, there was a porch on the front of the building. But the owner wanted to extend the front of the Exchange building toward the street. And so the front of the new addition would be aligned with the other buildings on that block, meaning where Newberry's was. So here's when it was under construction. And you can see this is from 1946, and you can show that the construction had begun. However, after just about immediately after the construction had begun, the planning board issued a restraining order to halt construction. Because according to a clause in the town's bylaws, the building could not be constructed within 10 feet of the boundary line of the street. Apparently, the planning board felt that the extension of the building would have prevented the town from widening Main Street. They said that because there was a traffic bottleneck in that area. They reasoned that they would prevent them. But then in September, the selectmen met and they said, the chances of us doing that are probably nil. And so the zoning laws actually had a provision that said that they gave the selectmen permission upon approval to set aside that clause. They said, okay, so they gave permission to the owner to go ahead and do the addition. So he continued, and that's the exchange. That's the extension of the building that we remember when we see Martin's department store and whatever. So, and here's an advertisement that was taken from the 1946 Franklin Sentinel. Up above on the second floor, there was a jewelry store, a new manufacturing company called Stoddard Jewelry. and they had costume jewelry up there, and that was the ad for that. It was located at 5 Main Street. It was over Martin's department store. So, and there was another business that actually was in that block as well. Dominic and Henry Fico purchased Sam's shoe repair shop on Main Street that was in that block, and they took possession of it, and they're ready to serve the public. And there it is, and you can see it was Fico's shoe store.
And free parking in back, even better.
That's right. But that's where Fico's first started, in that location. This picture was taken from 1949, and you can see that's where Fico's was. And then, in 1952 or 53, Fico's would move over to Depot Street, where a lot of us remember where they were. So, now this picture was taken from the 1950s, and we can see a J. Zanino had a store in that location. So, and then this picture was taken in January of 1962. This is just before J.J. Newberry's expanded into the vacant W.T. Grant store. If we look down in the Depot building, Depot Square building, you can see Newberry's was the building to the store on the left side of the building. In the middle was the W.T. Grant store. W.T. Grant had vacated that store about a year or so earlier than that, and Newberry's was about to expand into that location, but to make one big store. But Chuck DeWitt was the manager of Newberry's, and he felt that being such a large store, he needed extra parking. And so what they did is made the decision to tear down the Exchange building, and also the building that was down in the back on Depot Street, which was the original Sentinel building. And so the decision was made to demolish this building and that other building. And so as a result, Martin's department store had to move yet again. And they moved over to East Central Street in the block where the Morse Opera House was. And I can actually remember Martin's department store being in that location, because when I joined the high school band in 1964, I had to get white pants as part of my uniform. And Martin's was the only place in town that sold those white pants. So I remember going there to buy those pants. So.
Well, Joe, it's been interesting taking a look at these two sort of iconic blocks in downtown Franklin, the A.J. Cataldo Block and then the Exchange building, and tracing over a century of history with both of them, from pretty much the 1860s when they were first built up to virtually the present day, and seeing how many changes they went through along the way. It's a really interesting way of tracking some of the interesting small businesses that we've had in town through the years.
So, good.
Until next time, I'm Eamon McCarthy Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
Thanks for watching.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.